See you again. Hi, everybody. I can't see all of you, but I'm sure you're all out there.
That's good stuff. Before we jump in, Lewis, do you want to give a quick intro on yourself and what your day to day is at Moet?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, hi, everybody. Luís Freitas. If you're wondering about the name, born in South Africa, raised in Portugal, became an American citizen last year, which was my crowning achievement. So very, very, very proud of that. I've been at Moet Hennessy for about a year and a half, where I've been running the CRM practice, as well as overall omnichannel consumer decision journey building. So it's this idea of trying to understand across all our touch points, what is the right consumer flow, given that there's no such thing because the journey is absolutely fragmented, but at least try to create some logical narrative between the different touch points that we use with consumers versus broadcasting the same message over and over again. So I've been very focused on consumer journeys, and I've been very focused specifically on building CRM and data practices at Moet Hennessy.
Awesome. Thank you for that. I know today we're going to be talking about cultural marketing and the impact that it has, especially in today's society. I mean, one of the things I want to do is just make sure that everybody understands what Holler is before we jump into it. So a little background on Holler. We are a technology company that is focused on the messaging space. When most people think about messaging, they immediately gravitate towards iMessage. But the reality is that with the smartphone population that exists between Android and iOS, the application that exists on your phone has a messaging component to it. So from dating to gaming to business productivity to payments, we are bringing our technology into those applications and enriching conversations everywhere. And so if you're a user of Venmo, you'll see content that is, not only powering brunch conversations, but also if you type in return coffee, you'll see what we're doing today for Starbucks. So focusing on the messaging space and obviously, allowing brands to get as close to the consumer as possible. So to kick things off, Lewis, we were, looking at this space, and I saw recently that a brand had been talking about cultural marketing as an opportunity to introduce yourself to people through content. And I found that really interesting because, we play in the content space, but I'd love to get your definition of cultural marketing and how you view it as a brand.
Absolutely. And of course, I will give you my definition, and within Moet Hennessy, we might have slightly different notions across the different brands. I think cultural marketing is very close to the word omnichannel, or close to the word insights, which is everybody has their own a little bit of their own definition of it. I would say that for us, speaking on behalf of Moet Hennessy for a little bit, I think cultural marketing is the ability for us to insert ourselves in a relevant and pertinent way in the cultural zeitgeist of our target consumers. That's maybe the most wordy way that I would use to explain how we see cultural marketing. Because what happens with brands at Moet Hennessy, with brands like, again, Hennessy, Veuve Clicquot, Moet Chandon, etc., is that these brands have actually been adopted, lifted, and enhanced because of multicultures in the United States specifically. So our company wouldn't be anywhere if it wasn't for cultural marketing, and if it wasn't for not only the consumers having adopted us, but us taking the time to understand who this consumer was and adapting our communications to be relevant to them and respectful to what their culture is.
That's great. That's great. You'd mentioned a program recently that Hennessy had done that was focused on cultural, that you felt made a real impact, but also was relevant given the times and everything that's transpiring.
Yeah, absolutely. So more recently, we did a campaign that I'm particularly very proud of for the company, because I think it was the right time, but it was not done in an opportunistic fashion, which is called Unfinished Business. So Hennessy launched about 3 to 4 months ago an fund or an initiative in tandem with three well-known business associations related to specific cultures. So we're talking about 100 Black Men, the Asian Federation, and the Hispanic Federation, and the Asian Association for Commerce. And we basically created a fund to help COVID impacted small businesses in these three communities specifically. The reason we did it this way was first and foremost because of the way COVID impacted. So that's the bigger cultural insight, if we want to call it that way, is COVID has impacted businesses severely. And I don't need to say this very broadly because I think we've all seen it. But we know that minority businesses have been much more impacted than other businesses. And so we wanted to guarantee that we were giving back to the community that helped build our brand. Hennessy is a loved brand by the Black or African American community, by the Asian community, by the Hispanic community. And so we wanted to make sure that we were giving back. And so we created a program where people could submit their business, submit what their small business is, what are their needs, and working with these associations, we granted funds to help these businesses recover during and post-COVID. For me, I think that is one of the best examples that I can give of a hyper-cultural, relevant activation that gave back to the community that helped build us versus just talking to them and saying that things will get better.
No, that's great. That's great. I mean, we've obviously seen it with our platform, not only in, creating original content around, specific initiatives, whether it's, Hispanic Heritage Month or, even brands starting to look at unique holidays like, Day of the Dead and, planning around that. As you look at the next 6 to 12 months, what are you focused on, and, what's a priority for you? Obviously, given the current landscape, the thing that we keep hearing is that brands are planning and replanning and reprioritizing. So I'm curious to get your perspective of what's on the horizon for you and what you're looking at.
So it's funny, and we spoke about this briefly yesterday, but I'm sharing with the rest of the audience. We at Moet Hennessy and me overall, we tend to be very careful with the leverage of specific holidays in a cultural perspective, because more and more the consumer has become sophisticated. Consumers understand what data businesses have. Consumers understand what power marketing has and what power big organizations have. So when I see companies and brands advertising on one day of the year towards a specific cultural audience, and then never address that audience again, that makes me furious. So I can't even imagine what the cultures themselves feel when something like this happens. And I think that one of the best examples I can give on this is two examples: Black History Month and Pride Month. There's a meme going around that says during the month of Pride, everybody's gay, and then we're back to being straight. So we are looking into the next couple of months, understanding that there are cultural nuances to how the next quarter is going to look like for consumers, including specific holidays that are either shared or not shared. But our idea is to continue being relevant to our audiences by contributing to their culture versus hijacking it or try to be opportunistic with it. And that's because these cultures are already embedded in the way that we plan marketing, in the way that we plan activations, and how we talk to our consumers. So there's very little that has changed in the way that we're thinking about the next couple of months in terms of activating our audiences. I think it's more about understanding that irrelevant of culture, we're living through a very different time, people say a new normal. I think Lavazza said a new humanity, which I tend to love that expression. And I think that our plans are reflecting that, in the sense of being respectful that we're not exactly in the same mindset that we would typically be during Halloween and Thanksgiving and upcoming holidays. So we're making it relevant to our cultures as much as we can. And what does that mean? That means understanding, for example, how has COVID impacted the different cultures that we're trying to tap into, and how can we be respectful of them? So, for example, working from home. Working from home for me is a brilliant example of some brands are very forward on showing that working from home can be great, and they show pictures of people working from home, and you get time to see your kids, and etc., which is fine. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but let's not forget that statistically, and this is some numbers I read a while ago, so apologies if I'm misquoting, but 1 out of 6 Hispanic consumers can work from home. 1 out of 5 Black consumers can work from home. So when you're talking about working from home, immediately you are alienating maybe a part of your culture that is fundamental. And because they look and they say, they are not talking to me, they're talking to people who can afford to work from home and have those types of jobs. So that's the way that we are adapting our communication and our campaigns moving forward, is understanding how has COVID impacted you, and how will we give you something that is more of a relief and more of an added value versus being tone deaf to how this is impacting you ultimately.
No, that's great. I actually heard a quote the other day, don't call it work from home, call it work from anywhere. Because we've moved to being able to work from anywhere. And I've actually talked with clients and agency folks that, people are in all over the world now, right? And so you really have the ability. And I think the important thing that you're hitting on there is that, being aware, right? Being aware as a brand of the space and the communication and the message. I did a creative call a few weeks back and talked to a bunch of creative folks, and they were, doing creative every week because, they had to make sure that it included masks or it didn't include masks, and just being aware of the market and the consumer, right?
And absolutely. And it's ultimately about understanding that culture, while of course ethnicity plays an important role in culture, it is not the only thing that plays in culture. And I know this might sound very obvious, but a lot of the times I've seen culture and ethnicity used interchangeably when it's not necessarily the case. Culture in some cases is the culture you choose versus the culture that you were maybe brought up in, or the culture that you were born into, right? I read a statistic that I thought was fascinating just in that sense, which was 80% of hip hop consumption in the US is done by young white men. Which would typically, if you go with standard ethnicity and basic cultural backgrounds, this is completely counterintuitive. But it's really about understanding who's adopting culture and not letting yourself be just guided by one ethnicity, and two, generic statements, broad statements. It's being really in the zeitgeist of what your community is talking about.
Yeah, misrepresentations and lack of insights, right? So yeah. To that, how do you go about leveraging insights to then lead you down a path from a marketing perspective, and what insights are you looking for with your brands? Like, obviously, to your point earlier, there's a cultural aspect with your brands and the alignment that they have with consumers and cultures, but also, I'm curious to get an understanding of how you evaluate the insight to then lead you to an activation.
How much time do you have? I think so. Loaded question, a lot of questions in there. I think, first of all, it has to do with the data sources that we use and understanding what are absolute data sources versus what are relative or just broader insight-driven data sources. So it's very much, we use several data sources to just understand how our consumer behaves, right? Everything that goes from social listening to behavior in store to the news and how specific channels are communicating certain types of news to understand how this audience is perceiving it. So the first part of the exercise is just aggregating all our data sources to generate a couple of insights that we compare against what we've been doing and how it has driven performance for the organization. Then what we do is, as we look at our marketing plans, of course, and we understand, are we still being faithful to what our community is actually looking for and what our community expects us to do? Or are we sideswiping, or are we going in a different direction? And if we are we doing it consciously or unconsciously? Who are we leaving behind? I think that is always a key question that we place to ourselves, is by doing X, who are we leaving behind? Who are we ignoring? Who are we alienating? And sometimes that is almost more important than who are you targeting, because sometimes, because your target can be, I don't say easily found, but to a certain extent, you should know who's buying your product, but you should know who's not and why they're not, and what are you doing that might be alienating them. So our insights process is very much a traditional insights process as it goes to marketing planning and business planning. We get all the data sources that we have from real time to historical data sources, but then we ask ourselves the hard questions of, are we still relevant to those who love us? How do we become more relevant? How do we guarantee that we're not leaving anybody behind?
Yeah, that's great. I know in the last year plus that you've been with the company, you've obviously done a lot with regards to the brands and the KPIs. Outside of sales, what are those key performance indicators for you as it pertains to the brands and looking at it from a marketing perspective?
So we look at a couple of different metrics that probably won't be very new to a lot of the audience, right? So of course we look at sales, we look at brand affinity, we look at brand awareness, we look at brand consideration. But then we also are starting to look carefully at how consumers talk about us and what's the emotion of how consumers talk about us. So I mentioned, for example, social listening. We pay quite a bit of attention of how consumers talk about our brands, but more than that, how consumers talk about the category and how they talk about the industry. We operate in alcohol, as Quinn previously with Heineken. And operating in alcohol means that we need to have a very firm pulse on how are we being perceived, and are we being responsible and being perceived as responsible by our consumers. Because we have a very specific audience that we're going after, and we want to guarantee that we're LDA compliant. And this means everything from understanding that there was a problem with a product to understanding that somebody's complaining about the brand because the brand did something that was wrong and we need to course correct, but also to find where they're giving us brand kudos and where we can find insights to maybe something that we were not doing. So for example, if you think about cocktail strategies, cocktails are one of those spaces that they start bubbling up in social. Suddenly somebody finds a new cocktail, then they start just talking to their friends. You start seeing the cocktail emerge in pictures on Instagram and on Twitter and on Facebook, etc. And our ability to quickly find this and understand, is this relevant to our culture? Is this relevant to our audience? And turn that around into an asset, into a recommendation, into something that we can implement with bars, in something that we can implement with consumers. That's what we try to do currently to try and address those, let's call them softer KPIs of brand performance, brand affinity, and brand love.
Yeah, no, that's great. So you've got your pulse on this, probably closer than me with just the tequila and bourbon that I drink straight. But what's the latest cocktail that you've heard of?
I'm gonna say I haven't seen anything that really. The biggest trend that I've seen in cocktails recently maybe is just organic ingredients. It's consumers are getting more and more specific on what is in the bottle. So they want to make sure that they have products that are of high quality, that are not going to give them a bad feeling the next day, that just basically will treat their body nice or well enough. And on the other side, natural ingredients to go with the alcohol. So we started to see more and more people research how to use literally herbs and things that they can plant in their garden to create cocktails versus just adding Coke or adding Sprite or adding another soft drink. So there is a big tendency of how to make cocktails a little bit less sugary, more natural, more organic. That's probably the biggest trend that I've seen. So I've seen some very interesting everything. It's not sage, but cumin and coriander cocktails with vodka that are super interesting. It feels like you're eating a meal, but you're drinking a cocktail. And it's fascinating because you're starting to see a lot of consumers talk about it. The other thing that we started to see quite a bit that I think it's very interesting, and it's again a proof of how cultures start to merge and how this is so fascinating, specifically in a country like the US, is when you start seeing specific cultures contributing to new mashups. So for example, if you haven't tried it, a Vulcan Old Fashioned, so Vulcan is a tequila brand, ours, of course. A Vulcan Old Fashioned is basically an old fashioned made with tequila. It's amazing. It's because basically what gives the old fashioned most of the flavor. Yes, it's the whiskey, but it's the bitters, and it's the maraschino cherry. Try doing it with tequila, and so and you're going to see that you're going to love it. And what we started to see is these cocktails that have historically used specific products, people are swapping them and bringing their preferred drink of choice, which tends to be very cultural. So you to see tequila old fashions. You're starting to see sidecars done with something else beyond cognac. That's a bit of the trends we've seen. So a path towards the natural and a path towards merging and mashing up different cocktails to find new versions of that cocktail.
That's really interesting.
I can speak on it all day.
You know, when we were catching up, you had mentioned, you know, it's been a year. Obviously, the last 6 months have been very different. But you know, what new hobbies have you picked up? You know, we obviously have more time on our hands now, and you know, we're doing all these Zoom calls. But curious, any new hobbies or?
So it's interesting. I can't say that I picked up new hobbies, to be honest. I'm one of those people that is of the school of we're already going through a pandemic. You don't need to learn Japanese. Because I think everybody put an extra added pressure on them that because they are home, they need to do much more. You're already surviving through a quarantine. Give yourself a break. I would say that, as you can probably see, I'm a big video game player. So let's just say that COVID has been great for me to catch up on my backlog of 500 plus video games that I have across 5 consoles that I haven't been able to play. And of course, I picked up on a couple of TV shows. More specifically, and I'm not very proud of this, but I will say it's Selling Sunset on Netflix is amazing. So if you guys want to watch it, that's a great show. And Umbrella Academy.
Too good. We got some time here. I'm going to go to Q&A from the audience, and we got a couple questions here. First one being, what trends in consumer behavior are of particular importance to you and marketers now? As a question, and then how are they consuming media differently? Have you seen any trends there?
Yes, there's been some very interesting trends that particularly I've seen there. In terms of media consumption, I think it's been interesting to see desktop starting to rise versus mobile and it's been in a couple of reports that I've read recently. Just because what happens is people are walking around less, people are stuck at home, so they're doing much more of their work directly on their laptop because it's much easier. So you're seeing a little bit more laptop behavior than mobile. I mean, mobile still over indexes clearly, but you're starting to see a shift there that I find interesting. Gaming picked up dramatically during the last couple of months, as you might imagine. The Switch for Nintendo is selling and doing perfectly fine, and people are still spending the same, if not more, time on social. So we haven't seen a lot of changes there. I think that the biggest change of behavior, it's almost a Freakonomics effect to media. For me, that's been the most interesting thing to see on consumer trends and behaviors. It's seeing how COVID had a non-direct or non-perceived direct impact on other industries and how consumers think about them. So let me give you a very clear example. E-commerce for alcohol specifically. Majority of e-commerce for alcohol represented about 1% to 2%, up to 5% in some states of total sales for the category. Drizzly, which is a third-party provider that delivers alcohol, fulfilling from stores in your neighborhood, etc., has seen triple-digit growth for the last 6 months. What's happening is you're starting to see that the consumer has learned that they can buy alcohol online, and suddenly our category, which was far behind other categories in terms of e-commerce, has started to pick up. And so I always remember having these conversations with the business about and bear in mind, Moet Hennessy has always had a strong ambition behind e-commerce. But if the consumer behavior wasn't there, then it was a little bit difficult to work the dollars and to move the investment and to get people's attention. Now, when you're seeing stores closed or you're seeing bars and restaurants closed, people are picking up on e-commerce quite a bit. That meant a pivot on our strategies, that meant a pivot on our budgets, that meant a pivot on everything that we're trying to do with our consumers to address, again, what they're culturally doing and where they're moving and how they're operating. Those are probably the two big trends that I've seen. It's this idea of if I can't get it delivered, then maybe I really don't need it. That I think COVID has made for all of us.
Yeah, that's a great segue into the next question here with regards to, with everything that's transpired, media budgets have been reduced drastically. I'd heard one marketer say that their back to school budget was 40% of what it was last year. Obviously, we've got kids back in school now, whether virtually or in the classroom, but it's impacted marketing and media as a whole. And so how has it impacted your plans, and how have you adjusted as it pertains to that?
Well, it's impacted the plans quite a bit. I think like almost everybody's budgets. I think it's been a measured impact, as in we made the adequate changes so that the business could, of course, operate in the way that it needs to operate. But I think the budget changes to overall media and marketing and etc. were not just a choice of contingency because of COVID and reduced sales and all of the normal reasons to do so. It was also a matter of not being tone deaf with the consumer. Right, you're having COVID. Right after COVID, you had the resurgence, because it was there, but it was just the reuprising of the Black Lives Matter movement. It would be, I think, insensitive of us, specifically with our portfolio of brands, to, while all of this is happening, to at the same time be promoting, hey, buy Hennessy XO for X amount of dollars. Which we wouldn't do anyway, but we try. But I think the media question was also one of being sensitive towards what's happening with society and making sure that we're not advertising at the wrong time, because it might actually play against you. We are, of course, ramping up things as we start to see consumer behavior become a little bit more comfortable with brands advertising this time period. But I think in our case, it's been a very conscious choice between mitigating business and being adequate to our consumers.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. It's all about being aware, right? Being aware.
Just listening.
Yeah. So as you look at new technologies and new innovations, how do you go about testing and learning and evaluating new platforms?
We believe quite a bit in innovation, and we love to play around. I mean, we belong, of course, to the broader Louis Vuitton Moet Hennessy group, and as you know, our fashion brands tend to play a lot with innovation. With alcohol, we try to be mindful of innovation, right? Because we need to be careful, again, that we're reaching the right consumers. And a lot of the time, some innovations or some channels tend to be adopted first by younger generations than they tend to be by necessarily older generations. So there's always a concern there. Now, that doesn't mean that all innovation is off limits. I think it's about understanding always, what does this innovation deliver against the business goals? And sometimes it's not straightforward business goals. Sometimes it's not just driving sales, right? It's driving brand affinity, it's driving brand relevance, or in some cases, it's being part of the cultural zeitgeist that you effectively need to be playing in some spaces of innovation, right? So the way that we usually evaluate it is feasibility, of course, how secure it is for the consumer, and what business goal does that help us address it. If it checks the box for all three, we tend to move very fast. And particularly, I know that our CEO, Seth Kaufman, tends to be a agility type of person. So he loves when new ideas come around, and he comes and he pushes us to experiment. But with at least some certainty that we're reaching the right people with the right message, with the right level of responsibility, and without duplicating other efforts that might be doing the exact same thing.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. So when things don't work out, how do you go evaluating, and learning from it, right? I'm sure not everything works out, right?
It does. Of course it does. No, of course it doesn't. And I will say, in effect, it's funny. I kind of feel that we've all shifted from a culture of everything works out, or we pretend it works out, to a culture of everything can't work out. I think we've all, as business people, become smarter over time and understanding that with the amount of experimentation that we've had to do in the last couple of years with the change of the consumer ecosystem, that we've all made mistakes. Like, raise your hand if you've done a sweepstake on Facebook with likes. We've all done it. So the way that we look at it is always learning. What did we learn from this? What can we get out of it? And we always apply a lens, which I think is a very important lens that I think sometimes businesses tend to forget and marketers sometimes forget, which is, did it not work because it was the wrong time to do it, or because it was the wrong target, or did it not work because it was the wrong idea to begin with? And the example that I love giving on this, for example, it's QR codes. QR codes are seeing a resurgence now. Again, Freakonomics effect. COVID has accelerated the usage of QR codes because of people going to restaurants and scanning QR codes to see the menus to guarantee that there's no paper being passed around. But QR codes, when tried years ago, were not adopted. People were not using it. They were a complete failure, and immediately marketers all over the place, including myself, said, I am not using QR codes anymore. This doesn't work. Now you're starting to see people use it again. So it was never a matter of, does it work or not? It's more a matter of how you're using it. Are you using it at the right time? And should you try it again in a couple of years? So my recommendation to people when it comes to innovation, when it comes to learnings, is dust off those ideas that you wanted to do 5 years ago that might have been too ahead of its time, and think if they make sense now, because you might be sitting on a gold mine.
Yeah. And we've seen that with QR codes, with contactless payment, with Venmo as a partner. They've accelerated that, and are working on partnerships to pay with Venmo in a retail store, so that you're not even swiping a credit card or touching a credit card machine. So that contactless payment is definitely hit full speed on the highway.
Exactly.
Final thought, in the focus of cultural marketing, outside of Moet Hennessy, what cultural marketing initiative do you think a brand has done well over the last year, or that you as a consumer have passion for or connected with?
So there's a couple. I think I've seen a lot. I think a lot of brands did very nice things during this period, and not, nice is a terrible word for it, but I think I've seen some initiatives and some campaigns that I thought were very well done. If I'm going to point to a couple, and unfortunately the few that I have are very not experiential. Unfortunately, they're very much a TBC, but I think these were great examples of how culturally they found a way to make their brand fit what's happening and be relevant, right? One was Airbnb. I think Airbnb did a fantastic job with their experiences platform by guaranteeing that during this period where their hosts are probably not going to be able to host people, of course, because of COVID, they created this experiences platform where the hosts themselves can host a guitar lesson, a cooking lesson, etc., which I thought it was a fascinating extension of what Airbnb is, and I think it's building them for a much brighter future when things, I don't want to say normalize because I hate using that word, but when things reach where they need to get to. I think Dove's Courage is Beautiful campaign is again Dove nailing it on the head. It was a campaign where it was all visuals of the marks that doctors have in their faces from wearing masks all day, and then Courage is Beautiful. It gives me chills every time I see it, and I think it's so on the DNA of Dove while being culturally relevant at the same time. I mentioned Lavazza. I promise I have two more examples. Mentioned Lavazza. Lavazza is a weird one because Lavazza has been doing these commercials about the new humanity, using, if I'm not mistaken, Charlie Chaplin, a speech from Charlie Chaplin, and it's. I'll be honest, at the end, I don't understand what does that have to do with coffee. That's just me. But the beauty of how they're treating the new humanity and how they put a positive spin on where we're trying to get to, I think it's very powerful. And to a point that I still remember it. I remember it's Lavazza, but I still don't necessarily think I'm going to want to drink their coffee because of it, but it's in my consideration set. And the last one that I will say, and it's another obvious one, is Nike. I think Nike's pivot on their social strategy, they did a post in particular, which I thought was fantastic, which was if you always wanted to play for millions, you now can play at home, which is you are playing for the rest of humanity if you stay home and you help the virus not spread. That's the same as playing in a stadium in front of 1 million people, which I thought, again, core to the brand, in their DNA, sensitive to the topic, and positive. So these were 4 brands that I thought nailed it and did a really good job with this. And of course, I mentioned Hennessys Unfinished Business, as well as a couple of other things with Moet Hennessy, but I don't want to self-promote too much.
No, thank you for that. That's really impactful that brands are making an impact on you, right, as a consumer. So I want to thank you for the time today. Nina's back, so I think we're at time.
Yeah, Louis, we have learned so much from you. I don't even know what to highlight beyond a couple of the things that really jumped out for me is when you're thinking about your target audience. Also think about who you might be alienating with that message, because I think that is something that's not often discussed or thought about. And at a time like now, it's really important not to alienate audiences. And then I love that you said to dust off those ideas from 5 years ago that might have been ahead of their time. Back when I was at Bobble Bar and I launched video chat live on site, we were one of the first. And now it makes more sense than ever, but we were a little bit ahead of the time. So when you say to dust it off from 5 years, I'm like, oh, I have to go back to all of the ideas that I wasn't able to launch and see
exactly
what's time. But the QR codes was the perfect example. Now everyone's forced to adopt it. And we're all like, oh, this makes sense. This is so easy. You just pull your camera out and here's all the information you need. So
exactly.
I'm excited to see how QR codes comes back in a big way beyond just the restaurant menus. But what a great usage of the QR codes in the meantime. So thank you both so much for being here. This was, and every sentence was another tidbit that I just was holding on to. So that's fantastic.
No, thank you.